for someone who, like me, is quite an extrovert, where you can't see the faces of the people that you're talking to. But bear with me, and we're all getting used to this Zoom and what life is like today. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk a bit about the strategy, but I'm not going to sit here and dissect the strategy for you. You can read it in detail if you want to, but I'm thinking about some of the key points in it and sharing some thoughts, some reflections on what's going on and where we might go. As Tim says, there'll be a bunch of space for breakout as well. Tim mentioned a little bit of introduction to myself. That Tim mentioned that I was part of a community called Safe Space in Telford, and I was part of a little group that founded it nearly 16 years ago now. It's started off really just as a way of thinking about how can we connect with those that are outside church, and grew into what is initially, I guess, a small missional community, and now a new monastic community. In that it is a vocational community. Its aim is not to grow, but its aim is to think about our own discipleship and how we connect. You'll see on the screen an image there of that. It's not really a logo, but it's a bit of a description of our community. We're based in a new town in Telford, and there are 4 little symbols on there, and they tell you a bit about who we are. The first symbol up in the top left is the double Trinity symbol, the yellow one, and that's because our first value is around community, on being a community and being a community that is drawn into the community of God, hence the double symbol. Down at the bottom right hand side, we've got a blue labyrinth, and that for us is really an indication that our spirituality is about being pilgrims, that we acknowledge that each day and each place we go to, we encounter God in new ways. And that's part of that. That is really where our spirituality lies, as pilgrims. Then we've got the little pink handprint, and that for us is about mission. So where our lives touch the lives of others, and where Jesus intersects those lives and those stories and those connections that we make. So those are the 3 values of our community: pilgrimage, and mission. And then the 4th symbol, back up in the top left, the red one, is the cross of St. Brendan. There are 4 whales, and their tails come together to form the cross. If you don't know about St. Brendan, have a read. He's an interesting character, a 5th century monk who supposedly went on a journey that took him from Ireland to America with a bunch of other monks. And that for us is about, God gave us Brendan as a patron saint. And for us, that's about risk-taking, being willing to go on a journey wherever it may take us, not knowing when we set off where we're going to go. So that, in a sense, is about the pioneering spirit. And that journey's led us to do all sorts of things over the years. And just a few little images of the things that we've been involved in and are involved in, from worship in the community, in colleges, in schools, to Sanctuary, which was a 6-year project, a night cafe working with nightclubbers, gangs, the homeless, supporting the nighttime community, to getting involved in mind, body, spirit fairs locally and across the West Midlands, to Telford United Football Club, where I spent 10 years as chaplain and a director on the board of directors, doing ministry in the football club. Digital ministry, we do a lot of digital stuff, connecting with folk. We set up a Telford Press Facebook page at the beginning of lockdown last year, and within a week we got 300 people. It's quite funny because within a week we were the largest congregation in the town, praying each day for the town and people. And then at the bottom left, yellow ribbon, that is a big part of what I do now, is that I'm a chaplain and that we work with Yellow Ribbon. And Yellow Ribbon has about 45 ex-offenders that we work with across the West Midlands and working with prisons. This is a community, Safe Space is a community now of about 8 people. That's how it's never been more than a dozen, and that was always its intention. But the focus has always been on saying, well, God, you know, wherever you present us with an opportunity to engage, wherever you push us out, we're willing to set sail and go and see what happens. So we've been involved in all sorts of things, really. You can call them mission, you can call it discipleship, you can call it simply being part of the community that we're in. and seeking what God is prompting us to get involved with. So that's a bit about us and about myself. As I say, we've been here in Telford now for about 16 years. My wife and I and our now 17-year-old son as part of this little community. So what we're going to do today, this morning, is talk about some aspects of rethinking about mission and this idea of the mixed ecology and what that might mean and what that offers us as a metaphor, if you like, or a thinking about how do we do mission. I'm not going to offer you solutions. I'm going to offer you thoughts and reflections. You're going to offer some solutions, I hope, or some thoughts of your own in the breakout groups. But we're just going to spend some time thinking about it, really. And I hope that will be fruitful for you. And I hope it will prompt you to think about things in different ways and in new ways. Also interspersed through this morning, we've got some videos from the Diocese of Norwich, some different projects and different ways of engaging. So hopefully those videos will work. It's always a slightly nervy thing, but hopefully they'll work. So thinking at the beginning, we're thinking about this, reading the soil and the climate. I spent a few years living as a teenager in the Lake District and had fun helping out in the farms. And one thing that one farmer once said to me is, you know, you might think that farmers are experts in animals or in crops, but actually the main thing that farmers are experts in is the soil and the climate. Knowing the soil and the climate and spending the time to decide what it is that you can do in the land that you've been given, the land that you work, and in the region that you are, is crucial to being a successful farmer. You can't just plant what you want wherever you want it. You can't just have whatever animals you want wherever you want it. You have to understand the context and find the crop or the animal that is going to flourish and be nourished in the place where you are. So farmers are experts in soil and they're experts in climate. And that's a really interesting, I think, an analogy and a thought for us as we think about mission. And I put two passages up there on the screen. Luke 10, I'm sure most of you will be familiar with, when Jesus sends out the 72 and says, go and offer peace, knock on doors and offer peace. And at the beginning of that passage, Jesus says that the harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. The harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. Well, even those who grow crops in our back garden, tomatoes or strawberries, know that these things don't just happen. They need to be tended. They need to be nurtured. Sometimes they need to be pruned and cut back, but there is work to do. And I'm always encouraged by that passage that starts off with the harvest is ripe, but the laborers are few. That God is already at work, that God is busy, God is preparing and working, and our task is to join in, to be present in what God is doing. And Jeremiah, sorry, it should be 29 verse 7, sorry, typo there. Again, you may be familiar with it, when the people in exile turn to the prophet and they say to the prophet, well, you know, we want to go home. How are we going to get home? And the prophet turns around and says, no. This is where God has put you. This is where you're staying. And he gives them this challenge, which must have been really disturbing at the time, similar to that of the disciples in the passage in Luke 10, saying, stay where I've put you. This is where I've put you. This is your place. And he said that the prophet says to the people in Jeremiah 29 verse 7, plant gardens, start businesses, marry your daughters, pray and work for the peace and prosperity of the land, for on their peace is yours founded. There's something, therefore, that's really important about not seeing ourselves as itinerants, if you like, not seeing ourselves as the church as something that drops in and out, but actually as part of what's going on, of being part of the landscape, part of the community. So that image of planting gardens or reaping the harvest, it's an agricultural images that are all the way through the Bible. And in a sense that helps when we start to think about those images and we think about the mixed ecology. You know, I remember talking to Archbishop Rowan when they first coined the term the mixed economy. And we had a discussion about whether the mixed ecology might have been a better term, that perhaps less consumerist in the way that it might be interpreted. And I think there's something about to rejoicing in the sense of saying, well, let's discover what it might be. We've thought about the mixed economy for a long time, but the mixed ecology is perhaps in some sense more biblical because it has that farming, that agricultural image that Jesus was very familiar with as he walked the roads of Israel, Palestine, and saw what was going on around him. It was an image that the disciples themselves and those that were listening would have been familiar with too. They would have seen the sowers and the shepherds. They would have seen the farmers and the fishermen. They would have seen that all happening around them and understood something about the nature of what they were being called to do, to engage, to listen, to observe, to know the soil, to know the waters, to know what place they were in and what they were being called to do there. So that's just thinking initially about, well, actually, this is the beginning place, understanding the soil and the climate. If we're thinking about ecology, that's where we start. So what's going on? A few reflections from my own observations about what is going on and what life is like now as we live in this land. We live in a very unbalanced time. We live in a time when people are struggling, when there are mental health issues, when we're seeing an increase in addictions, in a desperation of life that leads to suicide and self-harm. But we're living in a land that hasn't yet worked out what life is like. We've, I guess, in some sense, come to get used to over the years a pattern of living to work. But since over the last year, and I know as someone who was put on furlough and then made redundant, having to reevaluate and think about, well, what is the balance of my life? What is going on? How do I make choices about life? And that's easy when we've got privilege. It's easy when we've got money, when we've got resources. But for many people, that's incredibly unsettling. How do we find that right balance? We're very much in an unbalanced culture. The pressures from all sides, the pressures to survive, the pressures to thrive, the pressures to look after those that we are responsible for, the pressures to deal with what's going on. How do I find work? How do I find stability in my life? And increasingly, I think already we were unbalanced. And I remember so many times over the years that how our attitudes towards mental health have changed in this country. A few years ago, I was walked into a pub in one of the rough areas of Telford to meet somebody, and they were late, and there were three guys at the bar, two guys at the bar and the landlord. And as I walked in and sat at the bar, they were talking about, well, they were comparing and contrasting their mental health medication. Have you tried this one yet? Has your doctor put you on that one yet? And it amazed me how open they were to talk about their mental ill health and the medication that we're using. And in some ways, that's a great thing that there is that ability to talk about it. But it's also an indicator that our mental health is not in a good place as a nation. That more and more people are struggling with their mental health because in part of the balance of life, of what are the values that our society is promoting, what are we working for and working towards. Secondly, you will no doubt be aware of this. I think we are an increasingly angry and divided country. Over the last few years, the last 5 years particularly, we've seen, I think, an increase in a sense of anger and division. We see it on social media. I don't know if you use Twitter, but it's becoming famous for being a place of anger and a lack of listening. But over the last few years, whether it be Brexit or Black Lives Matter, or now even mask wearing and vaccinations, there is this undercurrent of anger and division in our society. This is the place that we're called to be. This is the place that we're called to be peacemakers, brokers of peace in an angry society. Understanding what anger is going on, what is the condition, what are the things that people are angry about. I think we also need to be realistic. as a society and as a church even, we're exhausted. People are exhausted. And it's interesting that, you know, people have talked about, well, we've had this year of not being able to do anything, but the stress levels, the uncertainty, the imbalance, the division, the anger, the fear has left us as a society utterly exhausted. And that's the reality. It's not just those working in key workers and medical workers. More and more, I think I hear people just saying, we're tired. I'm tired. I'm tired of everything. I'm tired of not being able to do the things I want to do. I'm tired of not being able to see people. I'm tired of the uncertainty about work. I'm tired of the fear that there is in society, whether that be the virus or otherwise. We're exhausted, and people are reaching, to some extent, the end of their tether. I think it's been interesting and heartbreaking over the last 24, 48 hours of what's happened to the young lady and the situation there, and the sense of sheer exhaustion that's come through that, of women just saying, do you know what, we've had enough. We've had enough. And I think that is a sense in that there is that underlying sense right the way through our society at the moment, that people are saying, well, we've had enough. And that cry of exhaustion. And this is a huge one. And this worries me a lot, I have to say. I've had sleepless nights over this. We're a grieving society. You know, even in the most conservative figures, you know, the number of people that we've lost, friends and family, over the last 12 months, the number of people we've lost, the number of jobs that have lost and will be lost, numbers of family that are grieving relationships, you know, missing years. And I'm sure you, as I know, families that have not seen children that were born, you know, nearly a year ago, grandparents that have not seen babies that are now, you know, a year old, and grieving, missing out on that period of life. And that there is a question, I think, you know, we've in previous, when we've had previous disasters and situations in our country, there's been an opportunity, been an outpouring of grief. We can think about Diana or 7/11. We can think about all sorts, 7/7, sorry. We can think about all sorts of situations where there's been an outpouring of national grief and mourning. There hasn't been yet. There hasn't been an outpouring of grief. We are yet to grieve a year's worth of loss. And that grief that our society is struggling with is being buried and squashed. And my, you know, I fear that in the rush to celebrate the release of lockdown, when we do, there is going to be a gap, then there is going to be a crashing tidal wave of grief. And how are we prepared? How are we tilling the ground? How are we thinking, you know, what is that going to mean for our communities? What's that going to mean for our relationships as we engage with this grief that we ourselves will feel when our churches open again? Those of you that are, you know, involved in churches, and we look around and we see the faces that were here a year, 18 months ago, who are no longer here. How will we as churches grieve for those members of our congregation, particularly in churches with an elderly congregation? How are we ready to grieve? How are we ready to deal with the feelings that we will feel when we open our doors? We may be happy that our doors are opening again, but when we stop and look around our congregation and notice the faces that are not yet there, they're no longer there, how will we be ready for that? How will that impact us? And how, as a church, are we prepared to engage and support our nation in our world through this process of grieving? That's a really big question, and that's an underlying current. It's not as obvious as the anger and division or the unbalance. It's not as obvious as the exhaustion, but it's there and it's going on. And it is, to some extent, if we are not careful, going to poison the soil of our land. And of course, We're still in a period of uncertainty and fear. And our culture is very uncertain. People are very uncertain about their futures, very uncertain about their families, uncertain about their work, uncertain about their health, uncertain about all the things that they enjoy doing and have missed, whether that be pubs or holidays. When can we do these things? What will happen? Will this virus flare up again in another way? What is society going to look like? You know, I was talking to somebody in the church back in the summer, and you know, that question of actually what's going on and what's that uncertainty, and it's not just in society, it's there in the church too. What is church going to look like when we come out of this? There is no going back to what we were before. There can only be a going forward. What will that look like? And being aware of that in terms of who we are and what we're doing is part of understanding that soil, understanding how do we care for that soil, how do we understand what is going on, where it is deficient in nutrient, if you like, where it is fertile, what is happening, what do we need to do? And understanding our own uncertainty is a big part of that, but that uncertainty that's running all the way through culture, that's right across the world, but we, I guess, deal with it in our own context, in our own place. But uncertainty and fear. So those are some of the things. There's lots of other things, and there are things that you're already aware of. And what I've not done is gone back through things that were present a year ago, where we were. We knew where we were a year ago, and we knew that the struggles we had. We knew what was going on in our society. But actually, the soil has been changing around us, and I think that it's in one sense it's useful that we have come to this new metaphor of mixed ecology at this moment in time, to stop and to rethink and reimagine what mission might look like at a time when actually we need to stop perhaps and breathe and think about what is happening in our society. Where are we? Where might we be next month? Where might we be in 6 months' time? Who knows where we'll be in a year's time? But here is an opportunity to stop and to breathe and to think and say, well, what is going on? So I'm going to break into breakout groups now, and just for a short time, for 10 minutes, think about, what do I see? What's going on in my soil, in my place, in my community?